Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar or my webinar on surgical instruments versus water. It's kind of you to take the time out in these circumstances to join us, but hopefully we can go through and have a bit of fun along the way. I'd just like to welcome Bob Marrs, who is our guest panelist. You should be able to hear Bob through the presentation, and hopefully Bob can add some context to some of the slides as we go through. So very grateful for him attending and providing some of the pictures. So I was going to start off with this picture just to give a bit of really context to the current situation. It's a standard stock image that I've picked up, which shows the NHS. However, last night I was lucky enough to see a post by Ollie Newman, one of my connections on LinkedIn, and it really hit me as a heartfelt image that I think will resonate with everyone. So this was the image that he shared, which has been drawn by his daughter Daisy, who is homeschooling, so she's age 7. But I just, for all the healthcare workers out there, the NHS, sterile processing in theatres, just from me personally, and I'm sure from Bob as well, a massive thank you for everyone's efforts at the moment. Just to add that Ollie's wife is actually an intensive care doctor based at East Sussex. So the messages there from his daughter, are obviously really heartfelt. So we hopefully you can remember that image moving forward. So just I'm going to keep the camera on me just for a short amount of time, so you won't have to look at me all the time, because I'm conscious that some people have some limited space on their screen. But just to give a bit of introduction to myself, so the reason I'm involved in surgical instrument manufacture is really a family heritage, and that goes all the way back to the early 1900s, where George Poole, it's not a typo, it is Paul rather than Coole, started a surgical instruments business in London, and then so that was early 1900s, and then George was joined by Fred and George Coole, who were his nephews, who trained as surgical instrument makers in the early 1940s, all the way through to the 80s. And then Phil Coole, who's my father and the chair of Surgical Holdings, which is a company that I'm the MD of, got involved making surgical instruments as well, because there weren't enough of the family already involved. And Phil eventually opened his own business, which is Surgical Holdings, in '87, and we're still open and going strong. And finally, so I've been involved for around about 25 years in the surgical instrument manufacturer. I was an apprentice surgical instrument manufacturer and trained for a few years under apprenticeship. I don't think I was probably the greatest technically, but it's probably why I ended up staring in the office. But yeah, I learned the trade and what it takes to manufacture. I do have one slight admission here. The guy in the picture, he wasn't my granddad or great granddad. I'd actually just Googled man from early 1900s because I didn't have any pictures. So but there we go. There's an admission. So I'll just attempt to get rid of my my face for you all. So this is where we start, and this really, for me, like every story has to have a hero. And here we have, for me, is the hero on the screen, which I've normally would put it out to the audience to sort of volunteer what this might be, and I've had everything from chicken nugget to, I think my son called it a piece of dinosaur poop, but it is actually a piece of iron ore, and the reason I say that this is, I feel, the hero from respect to surgical instruments is this makes up iron extracted from iron ore makes up the majority of a surgical instrument, so around 80% of a surgical instrument. And in addition to that, there are of course other elements such as carbon, nickel, and chromium that all obviously play a part in the design of the instrument. So this is iron oxide. So this is our hero, if you like, in his most comfortable states. This is the most stable state of iron. So just to bear in mind as we go through, and you'll obviously pick up on why this is important. So as we mentioned, iron in its most stable state is iron oxide. You have to smelt the iron ore to extract the iron, and then from that we of course put it all together, and as an alloy we have stainless steel. What might look like a nice shiny surgical instrument here, you just have to bear in mind that there's a lot more going on underneath the surface. So there's lots of different, obviously, elements to it. The majority of that, as I mentioned, which is iron, and other elements which allow, for instance, carbon gives the device its hardness, and chromium, which I'll mention, allows the device to be passivated. So rust, and we all probably have an image like this. My garden gate hinges are particularly rusty, but rust is it's nature's way of showing us who's boss. So we have just an image here, which iron plus oxygen plus water equals hydrated iron oxide. So obviously it's obvious to say that iron, in its most stable state, has a benefit of mixing with water because it allows it to form rust, and rust has a very close relationship to iron oxide. So there be the relationship there. Don't worry, we're not going to do the whole song, but I just wanted to make the point that there is a bit of a romantic chemistry going on here. So we have our surgical instrument on the screen here, which is some sort of nasal chisel. Obviously delighted because it's the majority of made up of iron ore, and of course it's covered in water. So if we're talking about the most stable state of iron being iron ore, then this gives it the best chance to get back to that. So yeah, there is a bit of a loving relationship there. So what we have to do, we have to play our part, and we have to be the bad guys in this relationship. So that's everybody from sterile processing to surgical instrument technicians to theatre managers to everybody, all stakeholders are involved in handling surgical instruments. I guess more so from the perspective of a sterile processing point of view. The first step to breaking up this love story is to make sure that the instruments are completely dry. So that's obviously that they're completely dry when they come out of the autoclave, and also, of course, when they're out of the washer disinfector, because we want to ensure that there's no staining on the instrumentation. You might see things like this, and this is quite a common thing, which is easily missed on racks where perhaps they've been left wet, and it's just meant that the racks, the instruments are then perhaps closed up and then autoclaved, and when they're inspected, you see this water staining here. So this is quite commonplace. Is this something, Bob, just quickly, that you've seen before on instrumentation?
Yes, Daniel, it's a very common sight here in the U.S. We see all kinds of staining in the ratchets in the area. We'll see a lot of corrosions, we'll see staining, we'll see a bioburden. I'd like to add to the thought that you had about the operating theater. It's really, really important that they do their part in point of use cleaning before sending the instruments to the sterile processing or CSSD department. It's a vital part of maintaining the life and health of the instrument.
Okay, sure. No, and I suppose that also extends now more to the use of post-usage gels and sprays and things like that to ensure that the instruments stay moist. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that for sure, but also that they're taking care of the instrument and wiping them clean and flushing lumens during the procedure as well. It's really important that they knock as much of the bioburden off of the instrument as they can before sending it down to CSSD.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Bob. So looking at passivation, I mentioned obviously the importance when you're looking at a surgical instrument that you envisage the different elements and obviously what the effect of those different elements are with the surgical instrument. So here we have, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor on the screen, guys, but you have the stainless steel part, which is iron plus carbon plus chromium, to achieve passivation, which gives us the protection on the surface of the stainless steel, which is as little as 30 nanomicrons thick. Oxygen will react with the chromium in the steel, so it's a natural reaction that takes place. And then we're left with this nice layer. So in image 3 here, which gives us that protective layer. You have to add though that this is very susceptible to damage. So it could be easily scratched. It can be damaged by chemistries. It can be damaged by anions potentially in the water that the instruments are washed in. So we have to bear that in mind. And of course, we've got to remember that we have iron in the device, which is dying to get back to its stable state, which the closest it's likely to follow through would be rust. So we've got to bear that in mind, especially important when we're talking about drying instruments, as I mentioned. So this is an image that probably a lot of you have seen, and Bob kindly shared this with me, which is some really severe pitting. And this, Bob, you sent me through a few images, but this is probably one of the most severe ones.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, so you can see that obviously the surface of the steel has been attacked. And just to give a bit of background on pitting, I'm in no way a scientist, but I can explain that this is an autocatalytic process. So when the surface of the stainless steel, the passive surface of the stainless steel becomes slightly damaged, you have the potential for free iron to leach out. So the rest of the surface of the steel that hasn't been damaged becomes the cathode, and the pit, or essentially that you can see on the screen here, becomes the anode. Mix that in with an electrolyte solution if you're washing the instrument in water that has chloride, and there's a natural reaction similar to galvanic corrosion where the anions or the chloride from the electrolyte will be drawn to the pit. So that's why you get that aggressive localized attack of the surface of the stainless steel. The anions are attracted to the anode, and as I mentioned, that this can be initiated by any damage from water droplets, and it's certainly accelerated as a result of chlorides being present. Also mentioned sulfates and bromide ions. This is the sort of image that you may see when you can see the start of chlorides attacking the surface of an instrument. Also to add that organic residues such as blood may also contain similar chemical properties as chlorides. So I think that's what you're saying, Bob, that potentially could kick off a similar issue or a similar attack on the surface of the steel.
Absolutely, it plays a huge role in staining and corrosion of the instruments, and it's good that you're showing the distal end of the instrument, or where the surgeon may have their hand around the instrument in the ring forceps there. So you can see if they've got blood on their glove and it remains on the surface of the instrument when it goes down to CSSD, or for any length of time, it could certainly impact the surface that you were talking about on the instrument and that passive layer. It actually breaks it down quicker.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, obviously picking up from what Bob had said earlier, the vital importance of making sure that the devices are cleaned before they're passed to CSSD, because of also the issues around transit times and potential off-site sterilisation, where the bioburden could remain on the instrument for longer than we'd like, and that could start to initiate damage.
Mm-hmm. And Daniel, one other point about that, just to let everybody know, some of the more susceptible instruments would be a needle holder, and the forceps they're using at the end of the procedure, often they're closing the patient, and these instruments will often be overlooked, and so I see a lot of corrosion in the where the tungsten carbide is soldered to the end of a needle driver or forceps where the blood stays on the instrument, because typically they're in a hurry to turn the room over, get to the next patient, and they'll toss those instruments in the set without really cleaning them at all, so they can have a big impact. I see it a lot on suture scissors, on needle drivers, needle holders, quite often, and then the forceps that the surgeons are using.
Do you think that that's because sometimes we've seen in the UK that some of the perhaps the more common instruments that you know, like the likes of the sponge holders, stitch scissors, that perhaps are deemed to be the cheaper instruments in the set, you know, that may be overlooked, that they perhaps don't sometimes they're not always replaced when they should, just because perhaps they're not playing as key a part in the surgery.
Absolutely. Yeah, quality
Um,
definitely plays into that as well.
Great. And so the image on the screen now, we have Crevice example. It's, you know, of how potentially you might end up with crevice corrosion, box jointed instruments, where essentially crevice corrosion is the same process as pitting. It's based around, and here's just an image to show how you can start to get the corrosion from something like a box joint. The reason that this is related or called crevice corrosion is because for the instrument to remain passive, it has to have access to oxygen. So with something like a box joint, you end up with this image here where you have a shield, which probably would be the box joint over the surface of the steel, but likewise it could be any sort of mating part. And of course, if water gets on under the surface of that box joint or inside the scissor or whatever it might be, then the passive layer will start to break down. The process will be exactly the same as the pitting. So again, it will be sped up by the presence of chloride that will attack the surface of the steel. Free iron will be released, and obviously, ultimately, we've got a risk where the device could fail in use, which of course we do not want, and we want to do everything we can to avoid. So that's also to familiarise yourself with the term of crevice corrosion. Some of these processes will certainly be more familiar in or would be more common where there is only the presence of chloride. So what can we do as manufacturers and sterile processing departments to protect the instruments? Well, you can look at the surface finish. So if we look at the difference between here, and this is a study from the UK, which is from Honus and Harrison, around surface finish and the smoothness of the surface finish and how that relates to the corrosion resistance of the steel. And it's pretty common sense, really. The smoother the surface of the stainless steel, the more corrosion resistant it is. So I think if we're looking at things like aged sets or instruments that that potentially have damage to the surface, then we have to bear in mind that by refinishing these, then that gives them a much better chance of corrosion resistance when they're being washed. But also when you're buying new instruments, it might be a consideration that if you're in a hospital that has potable water, that there are certain finishes of instruments that may be more suitable to that environment. And there are so many different, obviously, variables to consider. But the smoother the surface decreases the wettability of the steel. So that's essentially how quickly the water flashes off of it. In the UK, we quite widely use bright polished instruments, and I know that's not the case everywhere, but that does give you a really bright, shiny finish, mirror finish that is of good benefit for that. So for manufacturers, following guidelines is important to make things a level playing field as a manufacturer. This is the front cover of a surgical instrument purchase and care guide, which the Association for British Health Tech Industries Surgical Instrument Group produced a few years ago. It's available for download if you Google ABHI surgical instruments, and I can share that link later. But essentially, it gives a lot of important information. For instance, the standard we should be following for stainless steel for surgical instruments. It's really important that this is followed, not only for the point of view of preservation of the steel itself, to ensure that it will wash and it will wash efficiently over, and the instrument will last a number of years, but also down to the usage of the device itself. So that's why it's so important that the correct levels of composition are there throughout the steel. So for instance, we have on the screen an osteotome, a device that's typically needs to be very, very hard. So you'll see the hardness level there, which is obscured by something in my software, but it's so yeah, 50 to 58 Rockwell. So it's very, very hard. It can only achieve this hardness if it has the correct chemical composition in it. So it has to have a carbon level of 0.42 to 0.5. And the chromium level is obviously also very, very important if we wish this device to passivate correctly. But it's just interesting to pick up that you will have a variation on the carbon levels throughout the range of surgical instruments, depending on what they do. So something like Spencer Wells, the carbon will be a lot lower, because when you harden the device, you don't need it to be as hard. You want a bit of flexibility there. So that's why it's really important that there's this international standard is followed. When a few years ago we were doing some research on sources of steel and iron, and we picked up this map. And the reason I sort of show it on the slides is that there's a lot said about the location of where surgical instruments come from nowadays, and obviously I think this is fine, providing the steels are sourced, and this is just a world iron ore map, a mining map here, but providing the steels follow the correct composition, really, as long as they're following that and that they're meeting the right criteria. But obviously we talk about a lot of surgical instruments coming from Asia nowadays, but if you look at the iron ore map, it isn't really any great coincidence that the darker color showing the sort of density area of where a lot of iron ore is mined. So it would stand to reason that instruments are going to be produced in a worldwide supply chain in countries in this region. So it's quite an interesting graphic. And also to mention that passivation is something that is standardized. There's an ASTM for passivation and how you should passivate, and how you can validate passivation as well, which is really, really useful. I don't know, obviously, Bob, in the US, the ASTMs, are they sort of standardized sort of working documents like we would have British standards?
They are a bit. We do not do much production over here as far as surgical instruments go. We source them from typically Europe more than anything, and they follow, I know they follow very close, very rigid, the DIN standard, and some other guidance to make sure that they're producing their instruments correctly, using the proper steel. It's really important. I think sometimes we can overlook that if we're not following that strict guidance on manufacturing instruments, that's where we can get some of the poor quality instruments into our instrument sets and hospital systems and things.
Yeah, and we certainly want to avoid that. And there is a British standard for producing some surgical instruments, albeit I think they're from like the late 80s. I think from when my dad was at his previous company, and they haven't been updated since, other than the stainless steel standard. But there is a standard. It tells you how long you should passivate for. As I mentioned, might be useful for people listening to have a look at that ASTM, because particularly for validating passivation, it's a good standard. So now we look at maintenance, and bizarrely, there is a picture of a baby on the screen, which you're probably actually wondering why, but this is really my only real context of using a surgical instrument and actually knowing that how important it was that it works. So this is my son Charlie, and this is back in 2012, and I'm trying to remember his actual birthday. I apologise because I've got 4 children, so it's not always as straightforward as it should be. But so he was born the 12th of June 2012, and I was able to cut Charlie's cord with a scissor. Don't worry, it's not actually this scissor. So, but I just thought this was quite an interesting graphic, and I thought I'd show it, because obviously we don't want to be using anything like that. This was actually the scissor I used, but it just made me realise how important it was to have a device that's performing and that's maintained, and just by sheer chance, it was actually a surgical holding scissor. And lo and behold, it actually even worked. So it was a happy ending in that respect. And now I'd just like to share a bit of my inspiration around maintenance for surgical instruments. And we obviously have an image of Nelson Mandela on the screen, and there are a lot of great motivational people around that that are still with us and have been with us over the years. And my motivation around maintenance and inspiration around maintenance of equipment is from quite an unlikely source, and I'd just like to share his words of wisdom with you now. There we have it. Roger Lloyd Pack, who is from the famous British comedy show Only Fools and Horses, and he I think is a great inspiration when you want to look at maintenance of your equipment. Obviously, you know, it goes to show that things will last a long time if you take care of them, albeit maybe not the same thing in its entirety. So I've just flicked through to the next screen, which is showing a before and after of really what can be achieved through refurbishment. So that indeed also counts for repair, of course, but just really to focus in on the surface finish and how you know, how you can, if you get a good quality instrument, albeit 20, 30 years old, if the steel is good quality, you can refinish it and you can repolish it, weld, whatever needs to be done to bring it back to a really high standard and potentially use it for another 20, 30 years. That's, you know, something that that can be achieved by the right skilled people. And actually, interestingly enough, protein is quite a big talking point in the UK. With our CJD issue from a few years ago, and a study was carried out back in 2010 by Southampton University, which actually picked up that amyloid deposits found in grooves or scratches of worn instruments, that could be the case, and obviously this could build up over a number of years. So it just shows that there's also that benefit of taking care of the steel. Yeah, the main thing is to remove the marks and blemishes, and then that will in turn reduce the risk of corrosion. And of course, you're doing your bit for the environment. I think before, obviously, the coronavirus took over the news channels, there was a lot around doing your part for the planet and being green. So of course, taking care of instruments is really important on that basis. Bob, have you got anything to add at this stage around maintenance on instruments?
Yeah, Daniel, I don't think I can stress the importance of maintenance enough. I often see instruments that are overlooked. I see healthcare facilities that do not have enough instrumentation, and they're not able to get their instrument sets out to the repair person that they're working with, and so they often go weeks, months, sometimes years, and a set will never be looked at. And so it's really important that you're able to get those instruments out. You know, I tell a story all the time. In my previous life, we were in a hospital doing an inventory, and some of my colleagues from Europe were with us, and they were kind of chattering, and they actually found an instrument by the mark on it that was over 100 years old in the set. Now, it should not have been in the set based on the way that it looked, but it just reconfirmed that point, that if you take care of these instruments the way that they should be taken care of, they can last you a very long time.
Yeah, indeed. You know, I think the point I made about some of the standards being quite old for stainless steel, that if the standards don't change and they were met all those years ago, then there's no reason. I mean, obviously you have things like CE marking that came in sort of the mid-90s, and instruments, of course, could be CE marked, but it might be that you're using instruments from before that time which are perfectly good quality. But yeah, as you say, it's having the inventory available for it to be taken out and maintained, and it seems crazy that it's not done on a regular basis, or you know, if you're not able to do it on a regular basis.
Absolutely.
So I just want to add, I'm picking up a few questions come through, so I think we'll pick those up at the end and try and go through them. We have a problem with audio, I think. I'm just going to pause for a sec because I think we've got a problem with audio looking at some of the questions, and we'll be straight back up again. Bob?
Yes.
Yeah, a few guys messaging saying they've got a problem with audio.
Yeah, I could not hear the video clips that you're playing. I could see the video, but couldn't hear any sound coming from them.
I see. Okay, just on the videos, Hank's saying. All right. Okay, I can pick that up. Okay, right, we're back on. Yeah, sorry, I've just seen that a few people saying they couldn't hear the clips on the video, so I'll share them after. But in essence, the guy with the broom was it's you know, a famous British scene in that he's sharing the fact that he's had this broom for 20 years, and it's this and it turns out that it's had like 15 different heads and 10 different handles. So, but he claims it's the same broom. So that was that video there. But I'll try and share it later because it is a great anecdote for taking care of equipment. So the challenging part of this, and this is a map of the UK, or not quite the entire UK. You'll see there's a huge variation in potable water. Some of that coming from rivers, streams, groundwater, and with that, obviously, with that variation, there comes a lot of differences in relation to the different anions, for instance. And this is really, really important, particularly if you're a site that just uses potable water. You can see the variation there across from Cambridge to Manchester and London, really just picking out the chloride and how high that is in Cambridge. So I think this is quite a really good bit of data to pull up. And what you can draw from that is that if you have issues with instrumentation, it might be pinpointing it down to your water content. I appreciate a lot of people have RO water, but it's certainly a consideration. And I'm no expert on RO water, and maybe it would be great to get somebody else doing a presentation on that, so they can talk through the effects. But it's certainly a big consideration, and when you have that sort of variety in content of potable water. And some
Daniel,
of the
I can jump in there a little bit if you'd like.
Yes, please. Yeah.
So one of the things that we've always coached our customers on when you're concerning water and steam, a lot of healthcare professionals out there don't truly understand the impact that water and steam have on the instruments, and it is a huge impact. So the 4 areas that we recommend that they look at are the pH level, the chloride level, and the conductivity level in the water and steam that they're using. Those 3 have the biggest impact on corrosions of instruments. The other really big one is silica that was on your list. That causes that brownish staining and really makes the instruments ugly. It's not as dangerous as the other 3, but like you said, they can have RO water, but if their water feeding the washers or their ultrasonics or their sinks that they're doing manual cleaning in is poor quality, then it's certainly getting those 3 levels of higher pH and higher conductivity and higher chloride content that's eating that passive layer of the instrument. So really important that folks truly understand the impact that water and steam has on their instrumentation.
Okay, so are we saying that obviously with RO steam, that even if you have water treatment, that the levels of chloride can still be tricky to to monitor, or I guess to mitigate against?
Absolutely, they need to be having regular testing of their water, and quite often people will treat the water, but they do not treat the water feeding their autoclaves. So the boilers can really have very poor quality water feeding them, which in turn, when the steam gets to the autoclave or the sterilizer, you're having the last process where the instruments are wet from the steam, and then it dries or bakes on those bad compounds onto the instrument, which leads to more corrosion. So really important, if they can, to have some sort of an RO or a deionized water feeding the boilers, which in turn then will create better steam for them.
I see. No, that's great. Thanks, Bob. The other thing, one thing I meant to actually put into the presentation, and I'll mention it just before I forget, but we were talking in the business here about any real surprises that we see when we look at instruments that we're maintaining and repairing. And I think one that I thought was actually quite difficult to detect was hollow-handled instruments and holes in them. So we found that if you're talking about potential wet sets and things like that as well, that's something to certainly look out for, because you can have a hollow-handled instrument that could be full up with water that would then wash across, potentially when it gets in the vacuum, leave all the other instruments wet. So that's just something that I think is worth mentioning along the way as a sort of key maintenance point.
And Daniel, I've actually had instances where when I open a sterile set, to evaluate it. I've picked up a hollow-handled curette or a mallet, and I've actually had water drip out of it onto me. So it's going to the operating theater where it has this basically contaminated water in the handle of the instrument. So great point.
Yeah, no, I mean, I had a similar experience in a hospital that that we were in talking to somebody in their sterile department, and you know, they were giving us a bit of a hard sort of a hard time about certain things and how they should be validated and stuff. And I went to inspect a set, and the first instrument I picked up was a hollow, I can't remember what it was, some sort of hollowed handle retractor or something, and it like sprayed in my face out of so, you know, that was like quite a shocking moment, really. But yeah, certainly something to look out for. I've got an image on the screen here. So which water quality is used and where? Of course, we're talking about taps, immersion, water disinfectors, steam generation. Is there anything else I'm missing there, Bob?
No, looks good.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And just also to mention that, of course, tap water, you can get rust that potentially could flush from the pipes. So that can also be a bit of an unknown contaminant that could pollute surgical instruments. Steam, obviously we mentioned that Bob went into some detail there, but even the evaporation of steam and of course this is quite an easy visual to pick up. You'll quite often see it could be sort of pools of minerals that when the steam's dried on the instruments, and you get almost like the sort of circular staining on the instrument. Are you familiar what I mean, Bob?
Absolutely. You can see the almost dried water spots all over the instrument. I see them a lot on more flat instruments like a malleable or something like that, where it's really visible, but you can find it often on most of the instruments in a set.
Yeah, I think I'm most familiar with it on where I've loaded the dishwasher badly and shut it quickly before my wife's seen it, and then opened it up, and obviously you end up with water spots all over everything where you've got shadowing, and because I've just been lazy and not done it properly.
Absolutely.
Okay, so going on to surface changes now. This is just a little anecdote I'll share that is around silicates. So a few years ago, probably sort of 10, 15 years ago, when we were first sort of trying to get out there to hospitals, we got a chance of an order, which I was very, very grateful for. And the rep at the time came to me and said, look, we can have this order, but we've got to replicate these fabulous rainbow colored instruments. And I looked at the images and I said to him, look, there's no way we can do this. This is, I don't know what this is. This is some sort of special coating. So anyway, we investigated it, and it turned out that actually it wasn't a special coating at all, and it was actually some traces of silicates from silicates containing cleaners, I believe. And I actually had a few years ago on a couple of world sterilisation conferences back, I sat in on a session by Matthias Schörner, which he went through all of the myths around silicates, and they'd done some extensive studying around this phenomenon that appears on surgical instruments. Interestingly enough, the conclusion was that actually silicates were shown to not be harmful from a perspective of damage to the instrument, but also from a biocompatibility point of view. So although it's very good to be aware of these, it's not always, potentially really, really harmful, but that's it. Then you've got to have the ability to distinguish between what's a silicate stain and what is a rust stain, which is another obviously another thing altogether. So just a bit on silicates there. Yeah, there's they can appear in a different way. They're drop shapes, so yellows, browns, blues, can be from excessive silicate or silicate acid in final rinse water or washing machine. Any obvious ones there, Bob, that you might pick them up from that aren't mentioned on that slide?
Yeah, certainly it could be from your ultrasonic, if they're running their ultrasonic and it's not fed with water that's more purified, like RODI, like we talked about, and also the autoclave. You'll see this a lot from steam that's not treated. but it's certainly an issue. Yeah, I tell folks all the time, the instruments, they're ugly, but they're okay to use. They want to send them out and have them refurbished as soon as they can, because like you said, it could make it difficult to determine whether or not it's a silicate stain or if it's true bioburden or something that has remained on the instrument.
Yeah, and in the case of the example I gave, that they thought that was actually a feature of the instrument. They are obviously extremely stained, but they can give that sort of almost rainbow visual. Just so at a couple of other instances, obviously chambers of autoclaves and I guess washer disinfectors as well. You can see things like lime residues, and obviously they're made from 316 stainless steel generally, so they'll be subject to the same issues around passive layers breaking down if chemistries are used that perhaps are on the higher pH side of things. So that's also something to consider and keep an eye on. But this also could be perhaps a first sign to pick up on, that it might be something that has a potentially longer term issue with your instruments.
Absolutely.
And it's very visual. Sorry, go on, Bob.
Sorry, Daniel. I was just going to say, a very good friend of mine, Dr. Gerhard Kernsey over in Europe, who I used to work with, he used a term called corrosion flu, and basically said that this rust, this staining, this corrosion can spread like a flu or like a virus from instruments to machines, from instruments to instruments to containers. So it's really important that you look at the entire process. But I really liked how he talked about that, calling it the corrosion flu.
Yeah. I mean, and it is something you can literally sometimes follow through the whole tray. If you get a tray and you hear that there's an issue with perhaps one rusty instrument, you can literally track it through. If it's, I mean, sometimes you might see older scalpel handles that are sort of old nickel scalpel handles that would have a similar sort of issue where you get brown stains rub off and that sort of thing. So it's certainly something to be aware of, and that's the important point, that if you're diagnosing issues on instruments, you've really got to look through the whole tray and perhaps beyond that to really get the full picture. So on the screen, just on discoloration, I've got a container there. Containers are anodized, which I suppose in the context of passivation is a sort of similar process to seal them, but high pH can damage obviously the anodizing, and then you end up with some sort of like chalky marks on the containers. That's what, and I think Bob recently shared quite a few images around this that were quite interesting to see. But of course, you need to follow the IFUs and ensure that the the relatively delicate aluminium doesn't get damaged in that respect. Titanium as well. More other delicate materials. So you've got some brass eye speculum on the screen there, and apologies for the blurred image, but it just shows the image on the right, which obviously, however, the brass, and I think I might be completely wrong, but there could be like Clark's type eyelid speculums that are made from brass. Delicate material will be damaged by higher pH chemistries, and of course obviously the issues around chlorides will be even more prevalent, but also to pick up on that nasty tape on those instruments there as well. So I thought this was quite a good image because I shared it I think a couple of weeks ago on LinkedIn as well, but hopefully we're seeing less and less of that tape on these instruments, but in this case it was still on them and it was still being used. I assume probably the tape meant that it was a certain surgeon's instruments, that they owned them or something like that, but shouldn't be on there all the same. So just to share a few common images we see now that I'll just run through relatively quickly. So this sort of corrosion that you might find in box joints and some scissors, where there's not perhaps signs of corrosion as yet, but where a lubricant may not be used with the instruments. And it's the same story with the surface of the device. If the instruments work through and the surface of the steel is compromised, then of course that will leak free iron and the process starts. So it's the message there that obviously if you see that sort of those sort of tide marks occurring on your instruments to act quickly and ensure they're lubricated to take care of them.
Daniel, that's a really, really good point there. I'll bring up something that I share here in the United States. I often will tell customers or hospitals that I'm working with that they do not even need to use the lubrication cycle that's in their machines, their washer disinfectors. Often the amount of lubricant that's being injected into the cycle, if you divide that by the number of instruments in the chamber, they're getting really minute traces of lubricant, and a lot of hospitals rely on only that. They're not lubricating at the inspection and assembly station where they should be, because that's where the staff can really feel the tightness of that box lock or the joint of the instrument. They can see that kind of staining. But like you said, it's important when they see this starting that they send these instruments out to get them refurbished as soon as they can. Otherwise, it will definitely lead to pitting corrosion.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, generally known as sort of fretting, or the start of fretting corrosion. But you're better off, I think, in my opinion, in using something like a pen lubricant applicator that you can really get in there and target the key areas of the device, rather than just washing it all over the device, which might cause other issues, you know, far beyond just the localized corrosion that can be avoided by doing so.
Absolutely.
This is so there's a SEM on the screen that some of you may be familiar with. You'll see that there's some pitting down the side of it, and this is almost like a sort of contact corrosion. And I'll flick it to the next slide, which just shows what I mean. So it seems that where the device was used, perhaps this is similar to what Bob was describing. It's then been closed up, and there were literally symmetrical contact points either side of this device. You'll see the little hole in there where the pitting has started to sort of take a hold. But again, this really shows the importance of cleaning the devices thoroughly after they've been used, or as well as you can in the time you've got, and just monitoring these key areas where there may be pressure on the device or contact points. I think you can also see, again, I'm obscured by my control panel here, but no, it's the slide before. So I think you can also see on the end of the device that where again it's closed up and it's tight, that obviously perhaps when somebody's finishing using with it, they're closing it up. You've got the pitting there that's picking up on the end there, which obviously we don't want to be seeing. Interestingly to add, this is actually from a cardiovascular set, where it does seem that a lot of saline's used as well. So we're picking that up as an issue that's causing damage to a lot of instruments. There's the use of saline in surgery. So I'll be interested to get some input from anybody at the end on that as well. So again, just to share another image of silicates, and you've got like a stress corrosion crack there in the device. Could be where it's not been lubricated and it's put stress on the rivet and on the box joint while it's being used. And the lovely colourful silicate colorings that from the coatings. Obviously another crack where the device has been overstrained, not related to water, but relevant all the same when you're inspecting and looking at instruments, to try and really use some good magnification to pick up these issues along the way. Another pitting visual, that clearly this is a sort of widespread issue, and perhaps the passive layer is broken down and there's a real consistent attack going on across the device. This is one of your images, Bob. Was there a story behind this one, or is this just sort of one from your catalogue?
Yeah, just one that I find when I'm out on the road. Excuse me, it's unfortunate, but we see a lot of this in sets that we inspect and that we go through as we're evaluating instrumentation.
And there's nothing, you know, when instruments are like this, we talk about refurbishment, but there's nothing that can be done to rescue that. I think the whole thing is compromised. You've really, I think, either giving it to the repair company is going to be a waste of time, because I think you've got to make that decision, trying to educate yourself and being familiar with this sort of pattern on instrument. Or, you know, you could show it to them, but for sure, in this case, this far gone, there's no rescuing the device. It would need replacing.
Absolutely. I usually pull those out of the set and make a little pile to give to the CSSD manager when I finish my evaluation.
That's a good idea. So they then know what to look for, perhaps in future. Obviously, future diagnosis of sets.
Absolutely.
This is a close-up of an instrument we were given to us as being rusty, and on a first look, I think from a naked eye, there's no way you could have actually picked up where you couldn't actually physically see it, and I've got reasonably good eyes. That a very slight part of the tungsten carbide on this needle holder was chipped away, so that had left really an unfinished surface, and naturally, when the instrument's being washed, you ended up with free iron being leached and the start of corrosion. But I think it's obviously a really crucial point that if we can't see through the sort of naked eye these issues or these small areas of damage to tungsten carbide, then you really do need to be using a magnifying glass or some sort of magnifying inspection lamp to look at this closely. I think you mentioned that earlier, Bob, about the TC needle holders and the inserts, right?
Absolutely. And enhanced visual inspection is so important, especially when folks start getting my age, when they have all the gray in their beard. I don't see as well, so I need some help to look closer at these instruments to make sure that they are in the shape that they should be in. And like you said, things like this, these tiny chips in the tungsten carbide can be very, very hard to see.
Yeah, I think you'd be forgiven for not picking it up through a naked eye, but as you say, it's really important to use visual aids to ensure that they're thoroughly inspected. This was an interesting one. So I think this is a rather nice looking retractor, but it seems that it's either been repaired with and obviously the part that's been replaced, or happened to be completely different steel from when it was manufactured. So this is probably some sort of like mild steel screw that's been used there, and that's, I think, this is really from the manufacturer's point of view. We've talked a lot about the damage that water can do and silicates and that sort of thing, but as manufacturers, this goes back to using the right materials for the right devices, and clearly this has either been repaired and that part has been replaced with incorrect steel, or when it was manufactured, somehow the instrument has gone through final inspection and passivation, and it's not been shown up. But from our experience, when you passivate something, which is obviously, for those who don't know, is obviously the artificial process that we carry out, which is putting the instruments in acid for a certain amount of time to create that passive layer, artificially in the manufacture. I think generally you'll see poor steels darken, and that's something to look out for. And of course, man-made issues again in relation to maintenance. This is a scissor that's been, looks very, very overground. The sharpening is so coarse that it's almost created serrations and it wasn't meant to be a serrated scissor, but it's created almost serrations along the blade where corrosion has started to take place and staining has started to take place. So obviously, very early stages, but nothing should be finished like this. It's so obviously it's got cause to start to stain. And I'm just going back to the surface finish side of things. There's, that should be a nice, clean, polished finish to ensure that the device does what you need it to do, and that be that cutting tissue or whatever. But yeah, you don't want to be seeing that sort of finishing edge, because you're going to enhance the issues related to corrosion. This is something we see a bit less nowadays because of the use of the widespread use of laser welding, but these sorts of retractors, sort of your Travers, West, Wheatlanders, previously may have either no sealant round the rack here we see at the bottom, or potentially solder or something like that, but that could easily be eaten away. And again, it's a perfect recess for when the instruments are washed, for potentially for them to sit in there to remain wet and for that damage to occur. So if you're buying new instruments, you should certainly look for those areas to have a nice laser weld around them, a nice clean laser weld, so there's no areas that water could potentially sit into after reprocessing. And some of the devices, just because of how they're needed to be, how they're used as a delicate pot scissor in the picture, a nice, really nicely finished grip that is a serration that's just generally quite tricky. I think this, I wouldn't have said it had Bob not mentioned it, but it just happens to have sort of patterns on where the surgeon's been gripping it here. Bob, would you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's often overlooked and not cleaned, and it's something that's pretty common to find on these types of instruments. And these are some of your most expensive instruments as well. So it's really important to pay close attention to those grooves and serrations on the instruments.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's, really high-end devices. These, the instruments. There's no question of the quality of the steel, but just the nature of the design leaves these quite tricky knurls, and I should imagine it's quite a challenge to ensure they're clean, but also a challenge to pick up when you might have some some bioburden retained in them, or indeed to check that they're actually completely dry after reprocessing and sterilisation. So these are sort of most frequent causes, and just to say, I thank you to a colleague, Paula Singleton Hobbs from B Braun in the UK, because she I've got one of her slides here from a presentation we did together a couple of years back. But so these are the most frequent causes of staining on instruments or surface damage. So poor cleaning, so leaving bioburden on the device. We've mentioned pitting corrosion, chlorides, and maybe some of the cleaning products, discoloration through silicates and the dosage, and also contact corrosion. I think that's quite a good one to pick up, particularly when we're talking, when we're thinking more about how the arrangement in the washer disinfector and how shadowing could possibly influence certainly the cleaning efficacy of the devices, but how they're arranged, and obviously how that could potentially damage other instruments through not allowing them to sufficiently dry. Would you say that's something that's very important, Bob?
Oh, absolutely. All of this is really important to look at, but kind of like I talked about earlier with the corrosion flue, these instruments that have corrosion on them, if they're left in a set and they're touching other instruments inside the set, it certainly can spread from one instrument to the other.
Sure. Good. And obviously solutions to avoid that, having a basket that may or may not look like this, where instruments can be nicely organized. But I appreciate if you've got large sets that are maybe like 100 instruments or so, it's not always possible to do this. But certainly with the delicate instruments, when we're talking about avoiding unnecessary damage to the passive surface of the steel, then certainly having them organized in a tray avoids that accidentally happening when they knock together. But I've also stringers are an interesting thing for us in the UK, because we only tend to sort of see Mayo instrument pins, but you've got some quite advanced stringers in the US, Bob, I think, haven't you, that allow instruments to be sort of fully opened and fixed so they can be cleaned. I've seen a few good looking products there.
Yep. Yeah, we've got quite a few of those products here. Some actually that will expand, and then others that are just come in a measured width where they'll hold the instruments farther and farther apart.
So I've seen we've got Pavel on the call here, which is good. So maybe I'll pick up with him just about cleaning efficacy and shadowing, because I know he's done a lot of work on that after we finish up. So other thing that's really important, as I mentioned, inspection. Get yourselves the right tools for the job when you're looking at your instruments, when you're watching them come through the sterile processing. And of course, if you're in theatres and you wish to inspect the instruments or the quality of the repairs you're getting, then you'll only be able to really highlight a lot of these things by having the right tools. Having said that, things like pitting and rusting are quite a visual, and you will be able to pick them up. But if you really want to get into the detail and pick up those really tough to see points, then vision is essential. And you might not be as happy as this guy, but obviously read the IFUs. He seems to be very happily reading the IFU, and I know that's an IFU because when I put it in Adobe Stock, that's the image that popped up. So he seems to be very happy about it. I'm sure that's not always the case when you're reading pages and pages of IFUs, but certainly just to pick up points around any delicate materials that could be accidentally damaged by any higher pH chemistries, or just any considerations around washing and drying. And obviously, you should always thoroughly read the IFU. So further discussion points that I'd quite like potentially somebody else to pick up on another webinar, if we can do that. So things to consider when you're looking at surgical instruments versus water. The time between surgery and reprocessing, how long is that? Is that, you know, you've got an off-site sterilisation and stuff is used and then it's sitting there overnight. And then I've got, obviously my bullet points didn't work, so a whole load others have jumped in. We're also looking at different materials now, and there are medical grade plastics, you know, that are used frequently on instrumentation, titanium. They all have their own considerations when looking at water and washing surgical instruments and staining. Use of pre-cleaning sprays and gels. I posted a video a couple of weeks back of me using, and I'm looking at it now actually, a Forever Prep machine that I think was from Ruhoff, which seemed to be a really neat solution for localized application of sprays and gels. And I've tried others, and that worked really well. I left the instruments for a few days, and there was no damage to the staining, or no damage or staining to the devices. So that's something to consider. Lime residue, I think I'd like to look into that a bit further and seeing what potentially the damage of that could be, because it doesn't seem to get as much traction as the other issues such as pitting and chloride damage. Instrument design and reprocessing instructions, of course, you know, we need to improve that. And with the MDR, when it eventually comes in, as it, you know, may or may not be delayed now further because of obviously the coronavirus situation, we're going to have to look at, as manufacturers, at validating our instruments to a lot higher level. So that's, you know, hopefully will go hand in hand with a better performance through sterile processing when these devices are being used. Final point I wanted to mention was just saline used in surgery, because a couple of those devices where I flagged that had stains on them were through saline. So Bob, is this something in the US that you've seen on particularly sort of CVT, cardiothoracic surgery, where you're getting staining on devices?
Yeah, we see that quite a bit. It has gotten better. Most ORs that I work with have moved over to using sterile water as opposed to saline, except for open heart surgery, things like that. They're still using saline, which they need to. But yeah, you can definitely see a difference in those instruments where it's impacting the surface of the instrument.
Okay, so and that's something that's essential for them to use for certain procedures in open heart surgery?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's certainly something that's, you know, that's worth exploring, and we're sort of I think we've more or less coming to the end now. I just wanted to reference the famous AKI working group red book. So this is a document that's produced by a collaboration of companies in Tuttlingen. There's really great detail around water spotting, discoloration and corrosion. You can literally read through the ins and outs. And I think your colleague you mentioned, is it Gerhard? I think he probably had some input on this through Esculap maybe. I think some of his colleagues are actually on the call. But
yes,
yeah,
he absolutely was.
Yeah, so it's a really crucial document, I think, if you're in sterile processing. Also to mention the ABHI document, which really has some good context from a UK perspective. So I'll share the links for both after. So yeah, just finally, just to leave you with the image of what I described as our hero at the start. Really, it's just, I think we just need to consider the importance that iron plays in surgical instruments, and of course its desire to get back to its most stable state, and how it's able to do that through mixing with water or mixing with chloride, or mixing with a solution of water and chloride. So please bear that in mind. And thank you very much for listening. I'm gonna attempt, I think, to put our videos back up now, so you get to look at our faces again. And I've got a few questions that I'll answer with Bob that have come through on the actual questions panel, and then maybe we'll try and open up the mic as well, if I can work out how to do it. Bear me a moment.
Great, Daniel. Can I add one more thing?
Of course. Yep.
And this may be one of the questions that are out there. I can't personally stress enough the importance of education and training for the CSSD professionals that are out there.
Okay.
Their knowledge and understanding of water and how it impacts the surface of the instrument, but also knowing what to look for on the instruments, knowing what silicate staining looks like, what beginning surface corrosion looks like, the friction, fretting corrosion, contact corrosion. It's so important that they're able to identify that when they're inspecting the instruments so they can pull them out of service before they make their way to the operating theater. So it's really, really, really an important piece of this whole process that the CSSD staff are educated and trained in this as well.
Yeah, we're seeing a real sort of appetite in the UK for more education to help identify these issues, because it's not necessarily something that everyone's so busy and you don't always find to have that formal education. So I think sessions like this hopefully will be helpful to everyone in even identifying one or two things that they can take from it. We've got a couple of comments here, questions, some comments. Hank Bausch has kindly added that iron ore is not as quite exciting as dinosaur poop, which I'm not sure whether that's right or wrong, but Gordon Allen from the UK, from Nuffield Group, his question is, what are your thoughts on laser marking instruments after purchase? Does this damage the passive layer and result in corrosion? I'll answer it and then I'll perhaps get Bob's input, but I think it's a risk. Personally, I think if you've got an instrument that's come from the manufacturer and that's been prepared by the manufacturer and passivated and it's essentially good to go, laser marking it after can be a risk, unless of course you're gonna then carry out those treatments such as passivation to oxidize it. Anything to add, Bob?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Often I'll see folks marking after the fact and they don't passivate, which then they'll start seeing elevated incidences of corrosion for sure.
Yeah, well, I think the concept essentially of a laser mark, and modern laser markers have an annealed setting. So Gordon, that's probably something to consider, because I think that does tend to essentially seal the device or oxidize the mark after you use it. So you get that sort of dark, mark, which you'll see on probably, I think some of the SCAP devices have it, which, but burning the surface of the steel with a laser is going to impact on the passive layer for sure. So let's have a quick look at what else we have. Right at the bottom, Hank has mentioned, he said, we've talked a lot about stainless steel and the challenges around water. How would infusing some type of antimicrobial metals such as silver or copper impact on this relationship? Well, that's a challenging one. We've had some minor experience with coatings through colleagues. Alistair Keane, who I know, Pavel, who is on the call, knows very well. There are obviously coatings that can be applied to devices, and that already are, such as titanium nitride, that are applied with a great deal of success and used in orthopedic implants and all sorts of things. So I would have thought that provided the process follows the similar sort of validated steps, then it wouldn't be an issue. I mean, copper and silver have it being antimicrobial. I'm not sure really how that will impact on the water, but it should give it some natural bug killing properties, Bob.
Yeah, that's some of the studies that I've been reading, that it is having a microbial impact on surfaces here in the United States, but I haven't seen it. It would be interesting to see a study done on instrumentation to see if it does in fact impact or help that.
Okay, well, I'm going to probably nominate Alistair Keane, who's an expert on coatings, to come on and do one of these talks, because he's got an amazing insight into antimicrobial coatings at a nano scale. So Hank, I probably can't answer your question as well as he do, so he will. So I will choose not to. So let's just see if we've got any other questions here. So this is from Andrew. does passivation layer on the surgical instrument grow thicker as it ages, goes through how many cycles on the autoclave? And this is something that I was asked a little while ago, and I think the easy answer for me is that it's a very chemical based reaction, passivation. So I think it all depends on the amount of chromium that you have in the instrument still, and obviously that needs to be within the correct ranges. And once you perform a validated passivation process, then you will achieve a passivated surface. We're yet to see a measure of passivation. I'm talking about an in situ measure, and something that in manufacture we wouldn't in situ measure the passive layer thickness, but you do hear that because this is a natural process, it gets thicker over time. I think perhaps what it means is it becomes more robust, you know, and as the instruments wash and oxidize more, that becomes more robust. But I'm not entirely sure about the thickness side of things, and I'd want to consult somebody around metals on that to give me a bit more info.
I would agree with that too, Daniel. I think it becomes more robust, and that's what they're thinking, as opposed to it actually getting thicker on the instrument.
Well, you certainly know that. I think when you put new instruments into a hospital, that quite often you'll have you'll want to run through maybe a few cycles to essentially because if they're straight out the factory, you want to ensure that there's no free iron or contaminants on the actual surface of the steel, even if they have been passivated. So then you gradually get that build up. But I think that's why we were saying that you might see instruments that are 30 years old that look to be in great condition, and I think it comes down to sort of getting what you pay for. That if you've got an instrument that has the right chemical composition, it's got a high level of chromium, you'll achieve that level of passivation, because that's essentially the reaction that gives you that. So hopefully that's vaguely answered that, Andrew. Do you have an IFU for every single instrument? In the UK, we have a validated IFU or cleaning instruction for a range of instruments, but I think that's something that that will obviously increase. Perhaps with the MDR, you'll see more product grouped validations. I can't see validating, I don't know how many there is, like 50,000 different instruments is ever going to be something that's going to happen, but perhaps validating a generic level for each area, maybe it's articulated or box joint, and would that be a feasible way to do it, Bob?
Absolutely. We actually do that here in the United States. Our standards talk about validation by families of instruments. So you would take stainless steel and validate a group of them, which we would consider the most challenging, and then that would cover anything underneath it. So it is very important. And IFUs, I'll just tell you, it's a dirty word here in the United States. Everybody talks about it. It's used everywhere. Every company has it. We're expected to follow them, but oh man, it's virtually impossible to do it. And it is important. We need them. We need to know how to take care of the instruments, but it's a huge challenge.
Well, just referring back to the very humorous image that I shared of the guy with the the big booklet and a massive smile on his face. That I appreciate that's certainly not the case, and particularly when you have obviously. We're on the sort of the basic end of the instruments, but when you get into the robotics and stuff like that, it's obviously a minefield. Corey Wilson has asked, from a product design standpoint, what's the best test to evaluate corrosion resistance of products? Some standards are very aggressive in the protocols, and I inevitably end up getting into debates with quality and regulatory folks to determine the best protocol. Well, all I would say to that is that I would follow if you're in the States, follow the ASTM, and if you want to for corrosion resistance, because that gives a range of tests, and I think there isn't a British equivalent or international equivalent. That's the only standard I've seen that gives a range of different tests to validate against corrosion. I don't know if you've seen anything else. No,
it's something that the manufacturers really held to, but not the user.
Okay. Well, I think that's all of the questions. So what I intend to now do is fire up, if we do still have everybody still with us, because I appreciate we've gone on perhaps a bit longer than we intended to, I'm going to try and invite everybody to get on the microphone. And just be aware, I think when I click on this, everybody's microphones might be open, so you might want to mute your mics. If you'd like to have a question or put something forward to myself or Bob, then please do. So here we go. So do we have anyone who may have a question or some more information, or could perhaps share with us, you know, some more technical advice? I can hear some background noise. Perhaps if there's someone on the call we know, just so I can prove that if this is working or not.
Hi, Daniel, Pavel here. You okay?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Pavel.
Excellent. I don't know whether everyone else can hear me or not, but if you can hear me, that's okay. I have a quick question about using passivating chemicals or using periodically passivating procedures to sort of prevent the loss of the passivation layer or maintain it. Is that something that you would recommend? If so, in what cases? Or would you rather recommend that things like that are actually done on the manufacturer's premises with a stamp of quality that comes from you?
Yeah. I mean, Bob, did you want to
Hi,
take that
Pavel,
one?
this is Bob. Absolutely. Yeah. So I would always want that to go back to the manufacturer. They have the training, the equipment, the capability of being able to do it properly, and to turn something over like that to a hospital. I think it potentially could change them in the way, particularly here in the States, in the way the government looks at them. The FDA might consider them then that they're more of the leaning toward manufacturing of instruments. So I would always push it over to the manufacturer side, as opposed to using that in a healthcare facility.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the most effective passivation would also be like a heated process. So having things like potentially heated nitric acid or citric acid is a bit of a risky thing. I think think for the welfare of him, you know, the healthcare staff, probably not ideal.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have anybody else who would like to? Thanks, Pavel. Thank you very much. Anyone else on the line?
If there's no one else, I'll ask another question, if I may.
Of course, go ahead. I think looking at most of the microphones, they all seem to be muted. So I think most people have got their microphones muted still. So I think just to say, if you want to ask a question, I think you have to unmute yourself and then ask the question. But yeah, Pavel,
okay. So my question is about different combinations of cleaning chemicals and water qualities, whether you have done any further sort of evaluations, or would you have almost like a rule of thumb type recommendations? So what types of chemicals, let's say, if we are talking about the pH level with that particular type of water quality, is there something along these lines that you would be able to recommend?
I think from a manufacturing point of view, we could only sort of recommend what our instruments are validated to, which I think is like a neutral pH. But of course, I think we find that there is quite a big mix out there of people who have obviously alkaline but I don't think there's a direct recommendation. I think again it's down to the manufacturer thing. Bob, would you say that it really depends what people are comfortable with, and they might be comfortable to say, look, you know, we've had experience of our devices being used with both and they're fine, so we're happy to go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Following the manufacturer's IFU is vitally important because they've done the testing and the quality work that needs to be done to make sure that these different chemistries are compatible with their instrumentation. Also important, I go into a lot of departments where I'll find detergents and cleaners that they purchased at the store and they brought into the facility. It might be I don't know if you have like Dove or Palmolive or something like that in the UK, but we'll find detergents like that they've purchased from the store and brought in and are using as well, and they really should not be doing that.
Well, I don't think anywhere has any of those left now, Bob. To be honest with you, I think they've all sold out.
Uh-huh.
So we're out of that danger. But yeah, I mean, I don't think we've really seen that. I've seen things that are like chemistries that I've researched and have been maybe catering chemistries that have been used, and that really I've been quite surprised that that's the case. But I don't know if maybe if there's a CE mark product and it's okay for both. But I have been, as I say, quite surprised to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Ollie Newman, whose daughter who kindly passed that image to me, by the way, for the start of the presentation, has thanked us and has had to head off. So, but yeah, it's very grateful to him for allowing us to use that. So, anybody else? Come on, while we're on, I think it'd be great to get some other questions from around the world, because obviously we've got a lot of people on here from the States, from Malaysia, from the UK. I don't think there's a lot else coming out. I don't know if Hank's still on the line. No. Okay, well, I think in that case, we will conclude our webinar, and I'll really thank everybody for listening. And please take care out of there. Everybody be safe. Let's keep in touch through these means and share some resources during these tough times. And as I mentioned when I posted and shared about the webinar, that I'll try and nominate a few other people who can hopefully pick up the baton, so we can maybe make this a weekly thing. I'm sure Bob will oblige if asked. But yeah, it'd be great to get some other people who perhaps maybe it's not something that they would do all the time. As I mentioned, it's the first time I've done it. I've really enjoyed it, and I've been lucky to be supported by somebody with Bob's experience. And yeah, thanks to everybody, and thanks to everybody for listening in.
Yes, thank you all very much.
Okay, take care. Have a good afternoon or morning. Thank you.